Assalamu alaikum, dear students. Welcome to the course Principle in Animal Life 2. This is lecture number 14. The topic is Inherited Disorders. Discussing agenda for the topic will be recessively inherited disorders, the behavior of recessive alleles, and dominantly inherited disorders. Lecture outcome. After watching and listening this lecture, students will know about inherited disorders and various related examples. Recessively inherited disorders. Inherited disorders are genetic disorders which are acquired by the offsprings from their parents. Thousands of genetic disorders are known to be inherited as simple recessive traits. So here you need to know about recessive genetic disorders and dominant genetic disorders. Dominant genetic disorder is one which is expressed in heterozygous form, and recessive genetic disorders are one which are only expressed in homozygous form. Both the alleles needs to be defective, only then such a genetic disorder will be exhibited in the phenotype. These disorders range in severity from relatively mild, such as albinism, which is a lack of pigmentation which results in susceptibility or to skin cancers and vision problems. This is one extreme. Another extreme is life-threatening disorders such as cystic fibrosis, which is a congenital disorder. Congenital disorders are ones which are present at birth, and this particular condition is a congenital disorder as well as a genetic disorder. What happens in this case? The alveoli are filled with sticky substance, and these alveoli are unable to inflate. Now, how can we account for the behavior of alleles that cause recessively inherited disorders? So which type of behavior is exhibited by the recessive alleles which results in these disorders? What happens at the molecular level? How the biochemical pathway is disturbed as a result of having defective alleles? Recall that genes code for proteins of specific functions. So genes are the functional units of DNA. Genes carry instructions for the synthesis of proteins. So whenever there is a defect in the gene, it will result in the formation of a defective protein, and a defective protein will not be able to perform a function in a normal way. An allele that cause a genetic disorder, let's call it allele A, codes for either a malfunctioning, abnormally functioning protein or no protein at all. So when an allele is defective, this allele either produces a defective protein or doesn't produce any protein at all. In the case of disorders classified as recessive, heterozygotes typically have the normal phenotype. Now, recessive genetic disorders will only be expressed if both the alleles are defective. If one allele is normal and the other is defective, then such a person will be termed as a carrier. Such a person will not exhibit any symptoms of the condition, but such a person can transfer the defective allele to the next generation. Because one copy of the normal allele produces a sufficient amount of the specific protein which performs the function normally. Thus, a recessively inherited disorder shows up only in the homozygous individual. So a recessive disorder will only be expressed in the phenotype when both the copies are defective. Although phenotypically normal with regard to the disorder, heterozygous individuals, they are termed as carriers because they are having a defective copy alongside a normal copy. The normal copy is controlling the function, is performing the function, and is somehow masking the effect of the defective copy. But this person can transfer the defective copy to the next generation. Now on the right side of your screen, you can see a cross between two carrier parents that are affected with albinism. They are in fact not affected with albinism. They are normal, but they are carrying a defective allele. And luckily for them, they have a normal allele alongside the defective allele. The normal allele is performing the function normally, so these parents are not exhibiting any symptoms of the condition, but both the parents are having a defective copy. So what will be the occurrence or the frequency of children affected with this condition in their offsprings? So you just construct a simple Punnett square. There you have 25% of the children will be normal, 25% will be albino, and 50% will be carriers. Carriers will be okay themselves, but they will be having defective copies. Most people who have recessive disorders are born to parents who are carriers of the disorder, just like here, but they have a normal phenotype. Carriers don't exhibit any symptoms of the disease, but they carry a defective allele and can pass it on to next generation. A mating between two carriers correspond to a Mendelian F1 monohybrid cross. So the predicted genotypic ratio for the offspring is 1 to 2 to 1. 1 is normal, both the alleles are healthy. 2 are defect carriers and 1 is defective. So it is a typical Mendelian ratio. And this is the ratio, F2 ratio. Thus each child has 1 by 4 chance of inheriting a double dose of the recessive allele, that is 25% chance. In a case of albinism, such a child will have albinism if both the copies are defective, just like this one. From the genotypic ratio, we also can see that out of 3 offsprings with the normal phenotype, these 3 offsprings are having the normal phenotype, but 2 of them are carriers. They are in heterozygous form. They have a dominant allele as well as a recessive allele. The dominant allele is controlling the trait normally, but the recessive allele can be passed on to next generation. Now you can construct a similar Punnett square for these 2 examples where one parent is heterozygous and the other is affected, where both the parents are affected. So what will be the frequency of the children affected with this condition if the genotype of their parent is this and this? Even if recessive homozygotes are able to reproduce, such matings will occur relatively rare because these matings occur for a much smaller percentage of the population than heterozygote carriers. So this will be relatively rare because it doesn't quite often occurs when both the parents are affected with albinism and they get married. What is quite often the case that both the parents are having a normal phenotype, they are carriers, and then they transfer it to their next generation. So this type of mating where both the parents are affected and exhibiting the symptoms of albinism is rare in the population. It may be because of some norms and likes and dislikes of the society. Now, in general, genetic disorders are not evenly distributed among all groups of people. So some individuals or individuals living in a particular area have high frequency of a deleterious allele as compared to other populations, as we will see in an example. So Tay-Sachs is a lysosome storage disorder in which the person is unable to make up an enzyme to convert the fatty acid substance gangliosides that are present in the brain into its metabolites. So what happens, these gangliosides they build up in the brain and then they pressurizes or hampers the function of the adjoining normal tissues, and as the disease progresses, the child loses muscle control and eventually this condition leads to blindness, paralysis and death. So the incidence of Tay-Sachs disease is disproportionately high among Ashkenazi Jews, that is Jewish population whose ancestors lived in Central Europe. So this condition is more common in people belonging to this particular group. In that population, Tay-Sachs disease occurs in 1 out of 3,600 births, and incidence about 100 times greater than that among non-Jews or Mediterranean Sephardic Jews. So you can see here that the incidence of the occurrence of a genetic disorder is also related to the particular race or ethnicity, and some people belonging to a particular race or ethnicity are more vulnerable to acquiring a particular genetic condition as compared to other populations. So this uneven distribution among results from the different genetic histories of the world people during less technological times, when populations were more geographically isolated and there were incidents of inbreeding, which resulted in the showing up of the recessive alleles in homozygous form. When a disease-causing recessive allele is rare, it is relatively unlikely that two carriers of the same harmful allele will meet and mate. So, when there are marriages between non-relatives, then the incidence of the combination of two carriers is quite rare. But when there are cousin marriages or consanguineous marriages, then sometimes the genetic disorders or the recessive alleles or the deleterious alleles are present in specific families, just like this case. So the cousin marriages, the marriages between close relatives, if are common in such populations, then there are more chances that the two carriers will combine and they will have an offspring which will be affected with condition. So such instances of marriages between close relatives are termed as consanguineous marriages and inbreeding, and they leads to inbreeding, depression, and the loss of vigor. The probability of passing on recessive trait increases greatly, however, if the man and woman are close relatives. This is because people with recent common ancestors are more likely to carry the same recessive alleles than are unrelated people. So thus, consanguineous matings are more likely to produce offsprings homozygous for recessive traits, including harmful ones. So the close cousin marriages quite often results in the propagation of these abnormalities, because, as already explained, some genetic disorders, some deleterious alleles are present in families, and when there are marriages between close family members or close relatives, then there are more chances that these deleterious alleles will appear in homozygous form in the offsprings, especially when both the parents are carriers. Such effects can be observed in many types of domesticated and zoo animals that have become inbred. So not only in humans but also in animals. When the animals in a specific small population breed continuously with one another, then it gave rise to inbreeding depression and the loss of hybrid vigor, and the progeny becomes genetically weaker and weaker with successive generations. Although it is generally agreed that inbreeding causes an increase in autosomal recessive conditions compared to those resulting from mating between unrelated individuals, having slightly different genetic backgrounds, so the mating between unrelated individuals doesn't result in genetic abnormalities in the offsprings. Now there is a debate among geneticists about exactly how much human consanguinity increases the risk of inherited diseases. So studies have been performed around the world as well as in Pakistan, and so far there is not a specific figure which could point out towards the risk involved in having children affected with genetic disorders in case of consanguineous marriages. So we don't have a specific figure which gives us idea about how much risk is involved in human consanguinity. For one thing, many harmful alleles have such severe effects that a homozygous embryo spontaneously aborts long before birth. So some of the genetic disorders are so much lethal that the individual dies shortly after fertilization. Sometimes the individual is unable to be born normally and results in stillbirth, which is the birth of a dead baby. Most societies and cultures have laws or taboos forbidding marriages between close relatives. So these rules may have evolved out of empirical observation that in most population, stillbirths, that is the birth of a dead baby, and birth defects are more common when parents are closely related. So what led to the development of such cultures which forbid the marriages between close relatives? It is because of the incidence of such cases which resulted in the forbidding of close relative marriages. Social and economic factors have also influenced the development of customs and laws against consanguineous marriages. Now, dominantly inherited disorders. Dominantly inherited disorders are those disorders which are caused by a dominant allele. A dominant allele is one which is expressed in heterozygous form, which can express itself in heterozygous form. So although many harmful alleles are recessive, a number of human disorders are due to dominant alleles. One example is achondroplasia. Achondroplasia is a disorder of bone growth that prevents the changing of cartilage to bone. So in this condition, the cartilage which is present during the embryonic development or shortly after birth cannot be converted into bone. So the result is dwarfism, limited range of motion at the elbows, large head size which is called macrocephaly, and small fingers, and normal intelligence. You can see the person affected with this condition here. So it is a dominant genetic disorder, and one individual out of 25,000 is affected with this condition. Now heterozygous individuals also have this condition because it is caused by a dominant allele, and dominant allele can also express itself in heterozygous form. Therefore, all people who do not have a chondroplasia, it is 99.99% of the population, are homozygous for the recessive allele. Now, let me introduce one other concept. I have already talked about it in the previous lectures, that dominant is not always good and recessive is not always bad. Remember that thing. Why? Because you can see here a chondroplasia is because of a dominant gene, and the individuals who are having recessive alleles, they are normal. Similarly, polydactyly is also because of a dominant allele. Deafness is also because of a dominant allele. Individuals who are having recessive alleles, they are not deaf, their hearing is normal. Individuals who are having recessive alleles, in case of the polydactyly, individuals having recessive alleles are normal. So dominant is not always good, recessive is not always bad. Like the presence of extra fingers or toes mentioned earlier, achondroplasia is a trait for which the recessive allele is much more prevalent than the corresponding dominant allele. Why? Because the dominant alleles are quite often lethal. The person does not make it up to the age where the person can marry and reproduce himself, so the person dies much earlier. Unlike chondroplasia, which is relatively harmless, some dominant alleles cause lethal diseases, and therefore the person does not make it up to the reproductive age. Those that do are much less common than recessive alleles that have lethal effects. A lethal recessive allele is only lethal when homozygous. It can be passed from one generation to the next by heterozygous carriers because the carrier themselves have normal phenotype. So it occurs only in case of recessive genetic disorders. In the case of dominant genetic disorders, the heterozygotes are also affected. Now, a lethal dominant allele, however, often causes the death of the afflicted individual before they can mature and reproduce, and in this case the allele is not passed on to future generations. So therefore, although the dominant genetic disorders are caused even if one allele is defective, but still the frequency of dominant genetic disorders in the population is quite low because of this particular reason. Where the individuals does not make it up to the reproductive age, the affected individuals. So a lethal dominant allele may be passed on, though, if the lethal disease symptoms first appear after reproductive age. So It is the only way where a lethal dominant allele can be passed on to next generation by the affected person. In these cases, the individual may already have transmitted the allele to his or her children. For example, in the Huntington's disease, the symptoms of the disease occurs from 35 to 45 years of age. Obviously, it's a time when the person is married and having children. So before the arrival of symptoms accompanied by this condition, the person had already transferred the defective allele to the offsprings. Once the deterioration of the nervous system begins, it is irreversible and ultimately fatal. As with other dominant traits, a child born to a parent with the Huntington disease allele has a 50% chance of inheriting the allele and the disorder. So you can also construct a Punnett square and the outcome of the crosses. In US, this disease occurs in 1 out of 10,000 people. At one time, the onset of symptoms was the only way to know if a person had inherited the Huntington allele, but it is no longer the case because of advancement in the genetic testing. We have tests like amniocentesis, we have tests like chorionic villus sampling, we have tests like pre-implantation genetic diagnosis that let us know about the presence of defective alleles in the embryo at a very early stage, and then effective strategies can be developed to minimize the symptoms. Now, by analyzing DNA samples from large family with a high incidence of the disorders, obviously you will get DNA samples through chorionic villus sampling or amniocentesis, and then these DNA samples are studied. The particular gene responsible for this condition is sequenced and looked for any harmful changes, and thereafter effective strategies to counteract the condition can be developed. So the Huntington allele is present on the chromosome number 4, and the gene was sequenced in 1993. Sequenced means the nucleotide sequence of that particular gene was elucidated. This information led to the development of a test that could detect the presence of the Huntington allele in an individual's genome. The availability of this test poses an agonizing dilemma for those with a family history of Huntington disease. Some individuals may want to be tested for this disease, whereas others may decide it would be too stressful to find out. Yes, it is quite often the case. Sometimes people does not want themselves to undergo a particular test because they think that if they came out as positive, then it will be stressful for them. So I think it's not a good mentality to have if you are tested positive for a certain condition, then you can minimize the damage and you can undergo the effective treatment strategies. But if you just keep your eyes closed and think that all is well, then maybe this condition slowly and gradually increases in your system, and a time comes when the no treatment is possible. So thank you very much. I hope you have understood the lecture. Allah Hafiz.